I heard 50 Cent explain why people go quiet around Diddy, and it shook me to my core. Not because of what he said about Diddy, but because everything suddenly made sense. All the silences I witnessed, all the warnings I ignored, all the people I trusted who chose to say nothing. And I realized I had to tell you this story because understanding why people go quiet is understanding complicity, fear, and the price we all pay for silence. This is what I finally understand. It was 2 a.m. on a random Tuesday when everything clicked into place. I was scrolling through my phone. You know that mindless scrolling you do when you can't sleep, when your brain won't shut off. Reels, TikToks, YouTube shorts. The usual noise. And then I saw it. A clip of 50 Cent talking about Diddy. Not gossip, not some throwaway comment, but a statement. Deliberate, careful, like he was choosing every single word. He was explaining something that had been sitting in the back of my mind for years. Without a name, he was explaining why people go quiet around certain people. And the moment I heard it, my stomach dropped. Because I knew exactly what he meant. I had lived it. I had witnessed it. And worse, I had participated in it without even realizing what I was doing. See, when you're in a certain world, when you're around certain people, you develop a kind of sixth sense. You learn to read the room. You learn which conversations to have and which ones to swallow. You learn which questions are safe to ask and which ones will cost you. Most people think this is just how the world works. You stay quiet, you stay safe. You keep your head down, you keep your career, you keep your access. But that night, listening to 50 explain it all, I realized something terrifying. The silence wasn't about self-preservation. It was about something much darker, and I had been complicit in it the entire time. I remember sitting there in the dark of my bedroom, my phone screen lighting up my face, replaying that clip over and over. Each time, it hit harder. Each time, another memory surfaced. Another moment I had pushed down. Another conversation I had witnessed that made no sense at the time, but now, it all made sense. I thought back to all the times I had noticed people change around Diddy. Not like they were being respectful. Not like they were starstruck. It was different. It was a shift. Like someone had flipped a switch in their personality. Like they were suddenly performing a version of themselves that wasn't quite real. Their smiles tighter, their words more careful. Their eyes constantly checking the room, checking him, measuring the distance between themselves and danger. I had seen it 100 times, and I had never named it. I had never even asked myself what it meant. That's what 50's words did that night. They forced me to ask the questions I had been avoiding for years. They forced me to look back at a person I trusted. Someone who had taken me under their wing, someone I thought I knew, and see them in a completely different light because that person knew and they never said a word. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This person, someone I cared about, someone I looked up to, had knowledge. They had information, and they had chosen, actively, deliberately chosen, to stay silent, to protect their position, to protect their access, to protect themselves. And I'd been too blind, too young, or too eager to belong to see what was happening. That's when I knew I had to tell this story. Not to expose anyone, not to make accusations, but because understanding why people go quiet, really understanding it, is the only way we stop being complicit in the silence ourselves. 50 Cent didn't just make a statement that night. He made me confront something I had been running from for years. And once you see it, You can't unsee it. The question is, what do you do with what you know? Let me take you back. Back to the moments that didn't make sense at the time, but now, looking at them through the lens of what 50 said, they make perfect sense. I'm talking about the silences, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something else, a heaviness, a weight that settled over a room the moment a certain person walked in, and I watched it happen over and over again, and each time, I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into social cues, that I was being paranoid, but I wasn't. There were rooms full of powerful people, people with their own platforms, their own voices, their own power, who would literally change their behavior the moment he entered. Conversations would stop mid-sentence. People would straighten up. Smiles would shift from genuine to performative. And everyone would wait to see what he wanted, what he needed, what mood he was in. It was like watching a predator enter a room full of prey that had learned the hard way not to run. I remember one specific moment. A party. Industry people, the kind of gathering where everyone's usually loud and laughing and trying to one-up each other with stories. The energy was high. People were having fun. And then someone said, "Oh, he's here." And the entire temperature of the room changed. People didn't scatter, they didn't leave, but they became smaller, quieter, more careful. I watched a guy I knew, someone successful, someone with money, someone with his own crew, literally excuse himself from a conversation and move to the other side of the room. Not because he was afraid of getting into an argument, but because he didn't want to be in the same space. Didn't want to risk being near whatever gravitational pull that person created. What kind of fear makes you do that? What kind of knowledge, what kind of experience teaches you that the safest place is as far away as possible? But the silences weren't just about physical distance. They were about the things people didn't say. I remember conversations with industry people, mentors, colleagues, people I respected, where I would ask direct questions about certain situations, certain incidents, certain behaviors, and I would watch their faces go blank, like a shutter had come down behind their eyes. They would give me these vague answers. "Oh, you know how it is. That's just how things work. Some people are just different. I don't really get involved in that stuff." Code language. That's what it was. People were speaking in code, protecting themselves with deniability, hiding behind plausible ignorance. And the thing that really shook me was that I understood the code. Part of me had already learned to speak it. There was this unspoken agreement in the room, in every room, that certain things weren't to be discussed. Certain behaviors weren't to be questioned. Certain patterns weren't to be named. It was like a collective holding of breath. Everyone knew something. Nobody was saying it. And everyone was complicit in the not saying. I watched a woman I knew, brilliant, confident, someone who usually had no problem speaking her mind, literally bite her tongue during the conversation about him. I could see her stop herself. I could see the words die in her throat. And when I asked her about it later, she just shook her head and said, "Some things aren't worth the risk. Some things aren't worth the risk." Think about what that means. Think about what you have to know or what you have to fear to say something like that. But it wasn't just the big moments. It was the small ones too. It was the way people's eyes would dart toward him during conversations, checking to see if he was listening, measuring whether it was safe to speak. It was the way conversations would shift. Topics would change, energy would redistribute. The moment he walked past, it was the way people would laugh at things that weren't funny, just to fill the silence. It was the way people would agree with things they didn't believe, just to be on the safe side. It was the way everyone was performing, all the time, around him. And then I realized something even more disturbing. People weren't just silent around him, they were silent about him. There was this invisible boundary that nobody crossed. You could talk about other powerful men in the industry. You could gossip about them, criticize them, question their decisions. But when it came to him, there was this restraint, this caution. People would lower their voices, people would look over their shoulders, people would make sure nobody else was listening. And even then, they wouldn't say much. They would hint at things. They would reference situations without explaining them. They would talk about people who had disappeared from the scene without wondering out loud where they went or why. They would reference his ways like everyone should already know what that meant. And the scariest part, most of the time, everyone did already know. There was this collective knowledge that nobody was supposed to acknowledge. This shared understanding that had somehow been communicated without words. How does that even happen? How does fear become so normalized that it doesn't even need to be spoken? How do you create an environment where people are so afraid or so invested in their own survival that they spontaneously create this wall of silence without anyone ever explicitly telling them to? That's the question that started eating at me, because I realized the silences weren't about him at all. They were about us. They were about what we had all agreed, without saying it out loud, to accept. And when 50 Cent explained why people go quiet, I finally understood that I hadn't just been witnessing this dynamic. I had been enabling it. Every time I didn't ask the hard questions. Every time I swallowed my own doubts. Every time I convinced myself I didn't know enough to speak up, I was part of the silence. And that silence was protecting something, someone. And I was about to find out just how complicit I really was. There was someone in my life who knew everything. Not everything about the industry. Everything about him. About what was really happening. About the silences and what they meant. And why people were so afraid. This person had taken me under their wing when I was younger, hungrier, more naive. They had guided me through the early stages of my career. They had introduced me to the right people, taught me the unwritten rules, shown me how to navigate a world that could destroy you if you didn't know how to move through it carefully. I trusted this person completely, and looking back now, I can see all the moments they were trying to warn me, all the moments they almost told me, all the moments they pulled back at the last second, like they were standing at the edge of a cliff and had suddenly remembered why jumping was a bad idea. It started small. I would ask this person direct questions about certain situations, certain incidents I had witnessed, and they would give me these answers that weren't really answers. They would tell me to focus on my own work, to keep my head down, to not ask too many questions about things that didn't concern me. Why? I would ask. And they would look at me, really look at me, with this expression that was part sadness, part warning, part resignation. Because some doors, once you open them, you can't close again, they would say. At the time, I thought that was just mentorship, just someone looking out for me, trying to protect me from getting too involved in drama that wasn't mine to be involved in. Now I understand they were trying to protect me from knowledge. There was this one night, I remember it vividly because of how the conversation went, when I was at a party with this mentor. We were standing off to the side watching the room, and I said something like, "Why does everyone act so weird around him? Is it just me, or is there something going on that I'm not understanding?" My mentor went completely still. I mean, still. Like they had stopped breathing. They stared straight ahead, not making eye contact, and said, "You notice things? That's a gift and a curse." "What do you mean?" I asked. They took a long drink of their cocktail, set the glass down carefully, and then they said, "The people who notice things have two choices. They can pretend they didn't notice, or they can acknowledge what they saw and live with the consequences of knowing." "What consequences?" I pressed, but they just shook their head and walked away. They literally walked away from the conversation, and I was left standing there, more confused than ever, but also with this creeping sense that my mentor knew something big, something that scared them enough to end a conversation mid-thought. Over the following months and years, there were more moments like that. My mentor would give me these half warnings, these cryptic pieces of advice that only made sense if you already knew what they were talking about. Stay out of his inner circle. Don't get close enough to be useful. If you witness something, pretend you didn't. Your career is only as safe as your discretion. I would ask them to explain, and they would shut down. They would change the subject. They would become distant and cold in a way that scared me more than any direct warning could have, because I realized they were protecting themselves. Not from me, from being around me while talking about him. They were afraid that just by discussing it, just by acknowledging what they knew, something might happen. That walls might have ears, that information might travel, that they might become dangerous to have around because they knew too much. And that's when I started to really understand the power of the silence. It wasn't just about fear of confrontation. It was about survival. People in this industry, people with careers and livelihoods and families depending on them, had calculated the risk-reward of speaking versus staying silent. And they had come to the conclusion that silence was worth more than truth. I remember asking my mentor point blank one time, "Are you scared of him?" They didn't answer immediately. They looked around the room, checking who could hear us, I think. And then they said something I'll never forget. "I'm scared of what happens to people who aren't useful to him anymore." That was as close as they ever got to admitting they knew something concrete. And I think about that statement constantly now, because it implies knowledge. It implies experience. It implies they had either witnessed something or heard about something that made them understand that crossing this person or becoming a liability to this person had real consequences. But they never told me what those consequences were. They never gave me specifics. They just gave me warnings wrapped in vague language and then retreated back into silence. I would catch them sometimes looking at me with this expression I couldn't quite read, like they were debating whether to tell me something, like they were weighing whether the risk of speaking was worth the potential good it might do. And every single time, they would decide it wasn't. The silence would win, and they would turn away. There was this one conversation, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, where my mentor and I were alone. really alone, nowhere near other people, in a private space where we could theoretically speak freely. And I said, I know you know something. I know there's something you're not telling me, and I need you to tell me what it is, because I'm trying to understand what's happening in this industry, and I can't do that if the people I trust won't be honest with me. My mentor looked at me for a long time, and I thought, this is it. They're finally gonna tell me. But instead, they said, the smartest thing you can do is stop trying to understand. Some knowledge is a burden, and I won't wish that burden on you. But I already know something's wrong, I said. I can feel it. I can see it in the way people act. Not knowing doesn't protect me. It just makes me dangerous because I'm naive. My mentor's face did something complicated. They looked almost relieved, like I had given them permission to finally speak. But then they shook their head and said, no, you don't know enough to be dangerous, and I'm going to make sure you stay that way. And that was the last time we had a conversation that even approached the topic. After that, my mentor became more distant. We stayed in contact, but conversations became surface level. They had clearly made a decision. The decision to protect me by keeping me in the dark, to maintain a wall of silence between me and whatever knowledge they possessed. And I respected that, I think, because I understood even then that they were making a sacrifice. They were sacrificing the opportunity to be honest with me, to truly confide in me, to treat me as an equal who could handle difficult truths. They were choosing to keep me at arm's length to maintain a mentor-mentee dynamic rather than allowing for real intimacy or real conversation. Because real conversation about him was dangerous. Looking back now, I can see how much courage it took for my mentor to give me even those half warnings, those cryptic statements. Each one was a small risk. Each one was them testing the boundaries of what was safe to say. And when I didn't press hard enough, when I allowed them to change the subject, they retreated back into silence, because that's what everyone did. That's what you learned to do. You gave people outs. You didn't press too hard. You respected their silences even when you knew those silences were hiding something important. And in respecting their silences, you became complicit in them. You became part of the machinery of not knowing. You became someone who, even if you suspected something, would never quite confirm it out loud. Because once you confirm it, once you say it, you can't go back to the comfort of plausible deniability. And plausible deniability, I was learning, was the only thing protecting any of us. My mentor had chosen plausible deniability. They had chosen to protect me by keeping me ignorant. And I had, without quite realizing it, chosen the same thing. We were all choosing it. And that choice, that collective unspoken agreement to stay silent, to not know, to not say what we suspected, that choice was creating a world where certain people could operate with almost complete impunity, because the silence around them had become so complete, so normalized, so acceptable, that speaking against it felt like the radical act, like the dangerous thing, like the thing that would get you hurt. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. That's what 50 Cent's words did for me. They didn't give me new information. They gave me permission to connect the information I already had, to stop pretending the dots weren't forming a picture, to stop convincing myself that isolated incidents were actually just coincidence. And when I started connecting them, everything changed. I realized I had been witnessing a pattern for years, a pattern of behavior, a pattern of how people responded to this person, a pattern of what happened to people who got too close, who knew too much, or who stopped being useful. Let me paint you a picture of what I'm talking about. There were people, talented, connected, powerful people, who were suddenly everywhere around him. They were in his circle. They had access. They had his ear. They were being elevated, promoted, given opportunities that seemed to come out of nowhere. And then, just as suddenly, they would disappear. Not like they left the industry. Not like they moved on to other projects. They would just vanish from that particular orbit. They would stop being seen with them. They would stop getting invited to the same events. And when you'd ask about them, people would give you these vague answers. Oh, they went in a different direction. They're doing their own thing now. We just grew apart. But it never felt like a natural parting of ways. It felt like an extraction. Like someone had decided this person was no longer useful, and they had been removed from the circle. I watched this happen to at least 5 people that I can remember clearly. Probably more that I'm not consciously aware of. Talented people, connected people, people who had been chosen by him, elevated by him, given access and opportunity through him. And then, inexplicably, they were gone. The first time I really noticed it, I asked my mentor about it. What happened to name? I asked. They were always around, and now I never see them. My mentor's jaw tightened. People move on, they said. But didn't they just get that promotion through? People move on, my mentor repeated, more firmly this time. That was their way of telling me not to ask questions about it. But I couldn't stop noticing. Because it wasn't just one person. It was a pattern. And the pattern was consistent. Someone would enter his circle. They would be given opportunities, access, visibility. They would seem grateful, excited, like they'd won some kind of lottery. And then after months or sometimes just weeks, something would shift. Maybe they would say something that rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe they would fail at something he asked them to do. Maybe they would become less useful than they had been. Maybe they would develop a conscience about something. I don't know exactly what the trigger was because people never talked about it. But the result was always the same. They would be out. And the remarkable thing was how clean it was. There were no big blow-ups, no public feuds, no dramatic exits. People would just quietly disappear from that social circle. They would stop getting invited to things. They would stop getting opportunities. And everyone around him would act like they had never been there in the first place. It was like a magic trick. Someone is there. Someone is not there. And everyone who witnessed it just moves on. But I couldn't move on because I realized something terrifying. If I was in his circle, if I had access, if I was visible, if I was being given opportunities, I could disappear too. All it would take was one wrong move, one failure, one moment of not being useful anymore, one time of knowing too much or saying too much or asking the wrong questions, and I would be extracted, just like everyone else. And nobody would ever acknowledge that I had been there. That's when the silence started to make sense. People weren't just staying quiet about him. They were staying quiet because they were afraid of becoming him. No, that's not quite right. They were afraid of what he could do to them if they spoke. And that fear, that primal survival level fear, was contagious. It spread through the entire circle like a virus. Everyone became complicit in their own silencing. I started to notice other patterns too once I was looking for them. The way conversations would shift when certain people were mentioned. People who had been in his circle and were no longer around. There was this unspoken agreement not to talk about what happened to them. Not to wonder out loud where they went or why they suddenly stopped being visible. It was like a collective amnesia. People had learned to forget, and in forgetting, they were protecting themselves. Because if you acknowledged what happened to these people, if you admitted that maybe they had been pushed out, maybe they had been removed, maybe they had been made to disappear from the circle, then you would have to ask yourself, could that happen to me? And if you asked yourself that question, you would have to confront the fact that your safety, your career, your continued access and opportunity all depended on not asking questions. All depended on staying silent. All depended on being useful. I watched powerful people with their own platforms, their own voices, their own power in other contexts, become small and careful around him. I watched them calculate every word, every gesture, every facial expression, because they understood at some deep level that they were in danger. Not physical danger necessarily, but professional danger, social danger, the kind of danger that could end a career, destroy connections, eliminate opportunities, the kind of danger that couldn't be fought or overcome because it came from someone with more power and more reach than you had. And the only defense was silence. The only survival strategy was to be useful, to be loyal, to be discreet. There was this one moment, and I think about this moment constantly now, where I was in a group conversation with several industry people. Someone mentioned, almost in passing, something that one of the disappeared people had done. Just a casual reference, and the entire room went silent. Not gradually, instantly, like someone had flipped a switch, and then people started talking about something else. Completely different topic, like the previous comment had never been made, but I had felt it. The danger in that room, the collective understanding that we had gotten too close to something we weren't supposed to discuss. And everyone had simultaneously decided to retreat back into safety. I realized in that moment that this was how the silence perpetuated itself. It wasn't enforced from above necessarily. It was enforced from within. We were all policing ourselves. We were all checking ourselves. We were all making sure we didn't ask the questions that would put us in danger. And in doing that, we were creating an environment where literally anything could happen. Any abuse, any exploitation, any cruelty, and it would be protected by our collective silence because speaking up would mean risking your career. Speaking up would mean risking your access. Speaking up would mean risking your usefulness. And in this world, your usefulness is your safety. I thought about my mentor constantly during this realization. I thought about all those times they had tried to warn me without saying anything concrete. All those times they had been on the verge of telling me something and then pulled back. They weren't just protecting me from knowledge. They were protecting me from the burden of knowing. Because once you know, once you can clearly see the pattern, once you understand what's happening, you can no longer claim ignorance. You become someone who knows. And people who know have to make a choice. They have to decide whether to stay silent or speak up. And speaking up costs more than staying silent ever will. I had watched my mentor make that calculation. I had watched them decide that their career, their access, their safety was worth more than the truth. And I had judged them for it. In my heart, I had thought they were a coward. But now, understanding the full pattern, understanding the complete machinery of how the silence was maintained, I realized they weren't a coward. They were a survivor. They had looked at the cost of speaking and the cost of staying silent, and they had chosen the path that let them keep their life. And I couldn't even blame them for that, because now I was facing the same calculation. Now I was someone who could see the pattern clearly. Now I was someone who knew. And I had to decide what to do with that knowledge. I had to decide whether the cost of speaking was worth paying. And that's when things got really complicated. Because that's when I realized that maybe 50 Cent wasn't just explaining why people go quiet. He was explaining why the silence is so rational. Why it makes sense to stay quiet. Why keeping your mouth shut isn't cowardice, it's survival. And if that's true, then what does it mean that we've all collectively decided survival is worth more than the truth? What does it mean that the entire industry had made a calculation and decided that silence was the smart choice? What does it mean that I was now making that same calculation? I became obsessed, not in a healthy way, in a way that started to consume me. After 50 Cent's statement, after connecting all the dots, after understanding the full machinery of the silence, I couldn't stop myself. I started digging. I started asking questions, carefully, discreetly, but I was asking. I reached out to people who had disappeared from the circle. Some of them didn't respond. Some of them responded but refused to meet in person, insisting on encrypted messages or calls where there was no record. And some of them talked, not in detail, not with names or dates or concrete accusations, but they talked. And what they told me confirmed everything I had suspected. There were stories. Stories about manipulation. Stories about coercion. Stories about people being isolated from their support systems and made dependent on him for their survival. Stories about threats. Not physical threats, but professional threats. Career-ending threats. Stories about people who tried to leave and found themselves suddenly blacklisted, unable to get work, unable to get meetings, unable to exist in the industry anymore. Stories about silence being enforced through fear. One person I talked to, someone who had been close to him, someone who had benefited from being in his circle, broke down crying when they finally started talking about it. They told me about a moment when they realized they weren't actually in a circle of equals or even a mentor-mentee relationship. They were in a cage. And the cage didn't have locks on it because nobody was allowed to acknowledge it was a cage. The worst part, they told me, is that you start to believe you want to be there. You start to convince yourself that the isolation is necessary, that the control is for your own good, that the silence is protection. And by the time you realize it's a trap, you're so deep in it that leaving feels impossible. I listened to story after story like this, from different people, different circumstances, but the same pattern, always the same pattern. Control through access, dependency through opportunity, silence through fear. And the entire machinery of it was protected by the fact that nobody was allowed to acknowledge it existed. It was genius, in a horrifying way. It was the perfect system for exploitation because the exploited couldn't even name what was happening to them without risking everything. And I started to understand something deeper about why my mentor had refused to tell me anything concrete. It wasn't just about protecting me from knowledge, it was about maintaining plausible deniability. if I had never asked. If I had never been told, then I could never be held accountable for knowing. I could claim ignorance. I could move through the world saying, I didn't know, I didn't see it, nobody told me. But by asking, by digging, by forcing people to talk to me about these things, I was making myself complicit in a different way. I was becoming someone who knew and was deciding what to do with that knowledge. And that's when I started to understand the real cost of the silence. It wasn't just protecting the perpetrator. It was protecting everyone else too. It was allowing us all to maintain our comfortable fiction that we didn't know, that we hadn't seen, that we weren't responsible, but I had broken that fiction. I had forced myself to know, and now I couldn't unknow it. I remember a specific moment. It was maybe 3 weeks after I started digging, when I was at an industry event and he walked past me. We made eye contact for just a second. And in that second, I felt something. A shift in the air. A recognition, maybe. A sense that something had changed between us. I immediately felt paranoid. I wondered if he knew that I had been asking questions. If he knew that I had been talking to people who had left his circle. If he somehow sensed that I was no longer buying the fiction. That everything was fine. And I realized, in that moment, that this is how the machinery works. The paranoia becomes part of the system. You start to feel watched, even when nobody's watching. You start to self-censor, even when nobody's demanding you stay silent. You start to police your own thoughts, your own questions, your own doubts. You become your own prison guard. And that's actually more effective than any external enforcement could be, because you're the one keeping yourself in the cage. I started to notice changes in how people treated me after that. Or maybe I started to imagine those changes. I couldn't tell anymore. My mentor became even more distant. When I reached out, they took longer to respond. When we did talk, conversations were shorter, more stilted. I felt like they somehow knew what I was doing, and they were pulling away to protect themselves. Other people in the industry started treating me differently too. Or so I thought. I couldn't tell if I was being paranoid or if I was actually experiencing real social consequences for asking questions I wasn't supposed to ask. That's another part of the machinery, I realized. You can't ever be completely sure if you're being punished or if you're just imagining the punishment. So you police yourself harder, just to be safe. You ask fewer questions. You trust fewer people. You retreat further into safety. And the circle of silence gets tighter and tighter. I became someone I didn't recognize. I started second-guessing everything I said in social situations. I started analyzing every interaction, looking for signs that I had said too much or revealed that I knew too much. I started keeping notes about conversations, tracking who had said what, trying to map out the connections and understand the machinery from the inside. I became paranoid, and I realized that was the point. The silence doesn't just protect the perpetrator, it corrupts everyone within its radius. It turns normal, healthy people into paranoid, self-policing versions of themselves. It makes everyone complicit, even the people who haven't done anything wrong, because they're all participating in the machinery of silence. I had a moment around week 5 of this obsessive research and questioning where I had to confront something terrifying. I had become so focused on understanding his behavior, on mapping out his system of control, that I hadn't stopped to examine my own role in it. I hadn't stopped to ask, what am I doing right now? Why am I doing it? What am I hoping to accomplish? And when I forced myself to answer those questions honestly, the answer was uncomfortable. I was trying to prove something. I was trying to gather enough evidence, enough stories, enough corroboration that I could point to it and say, look, I wasn't naive. I wasn't blind. I knew. But why did I need to prove that? Why did I need to absolve myself of the sin of not knowing? Why was I so desperate to demonstrate that I had seen what was happening? And the answer, when I finally admitted it, was terrifying. Because it meant I was as caught in the machinery as everyone else. I was trying to use knowledge as a form of self-protection. I was gathering evidence so I could later claim that I had always known, that I had always questioned, that I wasn't part of the silence, but in doing that, I was becoming complicit in a new way. I was using other people's trauma and pain as a tool to protect myself. I was turning their experiences into evidence for my own defense. I was no better than anyone else. I was just doing it differently. And that realization, that moment when I understood that I was trapped in the same machinery, just approaching it from a different angle, was when everything shifted for me. Because I realized that the problem wasn't him. Or rather, he was a problem, but he wasn't the only problem. The problem was the system. The system that rewarded silence. The system that punished honesty. The system that made it rational, logical, intelligent to stay quiet even when you knew something was wrong. The system that corrupted everyone who touched it, regardless of whether they were the perpetrator or the victim or the bystander. And I realized something else, something that made me sick. I realized that as long as the system remained in place, nothing would change. As long as silence was the smart choice, the safe choice, the choice that protected your career and your access and your future, people would keep choosing silence, even good people, even people who cared, even people who wanted to do the right thing, because the cost of doing the right thing was too high. And I had to ask myself, was I willing to pay that cost? Was I willing to speak up, knowing that it could end my career, isolate me from the people I worked with, make me toxic to the industry that had given me everything? Was I willing to become one of the disappeared? And if I wasn't willing to pay that cost, then what gave me the right to judge everyone else who had made the same calculation I was making? What gave me the right to expect other people to sacrifice themselves for the truth when I wasn't willing to sacrifice myself?